Oh, we're live.
Good deal. Say hello.
Hello and welcome. Our last time going through the book Fabricating Paul by Hermann Detering. And
The
this
fabricated Paul. The fabricated.
What did I say?
Fabricating.
Oh, okay. Anyway, we're finally finishing up the book, the last chapter, and then we're going to have a discussion of basically somewhat of a survey, a final conclusion discussion of the whole book. So how many loved this final chapter?
Well, I'll tell you what. Let's go through it. Let's go through it, and then we'll save our comments, general comments, to the end, and then we'll discuss the book. Then.
Did you,
How's that sound?
John? You said you drew up an outline.
Yeah, let me put it up main screen here. And this is just to help me go through it. I'm not going to go through every single point. Okay. So, can everybody see that?
On Plato's.
It's Plato's cave.
Yeah. So that's what chapter 4 opens with, is Detering starts dealing with the analogy of Plato's cave. So, should I go ahead and start?
Can you present it so it stays when somebody else? Yeah, it is staying now. Good.
Yeah, should. Okay. Chapter 4 begins with his analogy of Plato's cave, that criticism is analogous to Plato's cave, where it destroys the illusions. You see the reality, and you realize that you have two responses to that. One is that you can go back to your old ways of seeing things as if nothing changed, or you can go back and tell other people about it. So there's a lot of autobiography. It's been scattered throughout the entire book. I mean, he's often brought a lot of anecdotes of his own quest for this kind of stuff that he's working on. But he's basically making the analogy that just as Plato said you see the reality of things when you realize that what you're seeing are just shadows and illusions, that's comparable to religious dogma. And once you see that as an illusion, the historical facts are what come out and what becomes more important. So he says that it's basically as a freedom that one gets. All the people that are central to the Christian story, Jesus, Paul, all this stuff, becomes decentralized, and a lot of secondary characters that mainstream religion has marginalized, like the heretics like Marcion, characters like Thecla from the apocryphal writings, and other events that don't seem as important take on a more central character, and then it becomes more illuminating for Christianity. And then he goes on to say that the history that's put forth in things like Acts of the Apostles, and also possibly interpolations into the Pauline corpus, for instance, was a part of the church's agenda to appropriate a history for its own agenda. One of the things they would was, and he literally says that they stole the Hebrew scriptures from the Jews. Not in those words, but basically he makes that point.
They did.
Yeah? I'm sorry. Yeah. Okay. And he doesn't really give a lot of credit to what the church themselves did. They weren't the geniuses. The heretics were the geniuses. They had new ideas. They came up with interesting stuff, and the church appropriated it, gave its own particular spin on it. And that's what became the strength of the church, is that a lot of good ideas that were appropriated by the church and used by the church, and that's what made it a long-lasting historical movement. So this historical myth that they had created is what helped them triumph over heretics like the Gnostics. But it also had, and he does give some credit, that the church as an institution, for example, unified European culture, preserved it against its attacks from external forces. And also, some of the writers also had their own particular genius. So, then he goes on to discuss Jesus in relation to Paul. As the Pauline corpus is looked on as inauthentic or falsified or fabricated, that being the earliest writings, that puts into question the historicity of Jesus. But he personally doesn't consider the case against an historical Christ very convincing. because he sees a river of tradition. He sees multiple Jesuses all feeding into the gospel accounts and tradition. But ultimately, he comes to the conclusion that historically you can't know anything at all. But you must doubt the historical claims of the church. And in the place of that illusionary history, you can look for the real historical Jesus instead of the Christ of the various faiths. So he goes on, this is like we're halfway through it now already. Christian faith and the church are two different things. He makes a big point about saying that there's a spirituality of faith as opposed to a historical faith. He says that the church was ultimately a second century phenomenon, not a first century phenomenon, and that it was established and then created itself a fiction of history to serve its own ends in competition with other movements. So he basically wants to point, from that point on, wants to paint an idea of faith without historical grounding, a non-historical Christianity, for instance. So he emphasizes the spirit in religion is what's important. History is constantly changing. Our understanding of what is historical and what is not is constantly changing as things come up, evidence is uncovered, new research is done. So faith that takes historicity as its fundamental groundwork is going to find itself on shaky ground. It's constantly in flux. And a lot of people who only see faith as being tied to history will often just throw out the baby with the bathwater, as he says, that they'll go ahead and just give up on Christianity or religion completely. But he says that this uncertainty can only be met with radical theology rather than traditional theology. So what radical criticism has done is provided a clean slate for radical theology to expand on, this religion of the spirit to expand on, which is, I think, what he identifies radical criticism as. And he talks about the fortunate Hans story. But his interpretation is different from Pope Benedict XVI. Yeah, Pope Benedict XVI, who supposedly messed up the interpretation. But he's saying, we're not totally rejecting everything, and it's not a loss. What we're doing is we're reinterpreting, we're holding on to what we used to believe, using it as a basis, but not letting it guide us, not letting ourselves cling to it. So we can give up things, clinging to literal things like the literal resurrection, literal ascension, literal virgin birth, and instead being religion of the book, where everything has to be literal, legal, and no room for any kind of doubt or anything like that. That is a detriment to real historical inquiry, which allows you to see the true history behind it. So even the Pauline corpus itself was unconcerned with historical faith, as he attempted to show, that there was no interest of whoever wrote the Pauline corpus in the historical Jesus, the facts of Jesus' historical existence. But if you see them as parables, metaphor stories, then they have a spiritual quality that transcends the literalness. It becomes something that, for the individual, becomes present and active. So his emphasis is on as a spiritual approach. So his idea is that the church no longer should exist. It should be replaced by true religion rather than as an institutional form. If it does exist, it should be only as an aid for the individual to reach their spiritual goals, which is freedom, having the adventure of the spirit, coming to a spiritual understanding of their own. The end.
That was well done.
I did that just before the Hangout. I just converted it to a PowerPoint just at 8:30, so I didn't actually get to go through it or anything. So.
No, it's well done. I think it pretty much touches on the most salient points of the chapter. And
as you can see, it had nothing to do with the previous 3 chapters. It was just a personal statement, really.
Yeah, and in that sense, it is kind of superfluous to the thesis of the book, like Wynne says. But I kind of enjoyed it in the same way that I enjoyed the last chapter of Thomas Brody's book. It reminded me of it, where at the end of making a thesis, he goes into why it shouldn't matter for religion, and in that sense, I kind of appreciate it, even though I kind of have no use for the religiosity of it. But I do appreciate the points he made about about if something is, if the historicity of something comes into question, there's no need to kind of circle the wagons and kind of defend it tooth and nail, which is what people seem to do on more conservative approaches.
Yeah, it wasn't too relevant for me, from my background, but I could see where he's coming from, and it's good to see that people can let go of the bad aspects of religion and concentrate on what they perceive as good as part of their own development, their own journey through life. So, that's great, because that liberalism is what keeps conflicts from occurring, where you don't have partisanship, where people are drawing lines in the sand all the time and wanting to fight over stuff. So, if you have a more broad-minded approach, that leads to better relations amongst people. So that's the good part of it, I think.
Except ultimately, I don't think it does. When I look around me, actually, I've had several discussions with some people who are pretty conservative in their religious views, and they seem to think that liberalism is the same thing but on the other side. They don't realize that the implications that we just made. In other words, it's kind of like saying, well, I guess I shouldn't say this because it's going to be a little bit politically charged, so I'm going to never mind that. But in other words, liberalism is not the opposite of conservatism from this point of view. You dig what I'm saying?
Right, but people tend to paint people that that do disagree with them, in demonized colors. They want to make it the ultimate enemy, even if there's a lot of common ground.
Right.
Judean peoples.
Exactly. It's better.
I feel like a little puzzle when I when I hear people defend their Christian faith when they can attack and destroy the historicity of it. Then to me it all rests on then revelations that people receive, like Paul, whoever he was, and like for us later to trust in those revelations, these subjective hallucinations, possibly. Like, why would I have any real interest in a subjective hallucination that some guy may have had 2,000 years ago? I mean, do I even?
Because it either resonates with your sensibility or it doesn't.
There's also the tendency to want to think that your faith is the one true faith. Well, if there was a guy named Jesus who existed, said these things, did these things, then that makes it true, historically true. And other people's religions are a bunch of hellfire nonsense.
I guess I'm saying it only seems to me ever to have any value if it's backed up by history, so that if Jesus actually lived and did these great, amazing things, then there's a reason why people were won over to him. But if there never existed somebody like this, then now we're only just talking in theory here and making up stories, and then what can be compelling about that?
Well, but
like UFO religion.
Right, exactly. But that's the history of religion in general, Dale. In other words, I think people knew that Zeus was not a historical thing, but that didn't change the fact that the stories were kind of being told and were part of the mythology of that region.
I think also Detering is making the point that in this day and age, you no longer really need that historical faith. It won. Christianity defeated all its enemies, more or less. And now, you can basically, it can be whatever you want. I mean, look at what they call cafeteria Catholics, who, they'll pick and choose what they want to believe and what they don't want to believe, So it's the same thing with religion. You can be spiritual without having any kind of grounding for it. You can make it up if you want, like Raelianism and
Mormonism.
UFOs and, that kind of stuff. It could have no connection to anything historical and still be believed by millions. And there are other religions, like, I don't think most Hindus think that a lot of this stuff actually occurred in history. Maybe I'm wrong. But
yeah, I think that, that's a good point. I think that religion being based on historicity of events is kind of a novelty only in the last couple thousand years. I think religion was the province of mythology, and still is, given the fact that most of these things are not historical in the first place. Now we're finding out.
Yeah.
The fact that we thought they were kind of influenced the paradigm we're in now, but now that we're finding out that they're not, we're basically putting religion back in its rightful place in mythology.
Yeah, it wasn't the church militant, as they used to say, for nothing, because the Christianity grew up in a very highly competitive historical situation. So any advantage that it could glean over others would be good. I mean, a lot of the other churches that call themselves Christian were actually more popular at any given point. So, any weapon that they could use, and it's all about power struggle, I think. It's one of the few religions that have a really bloody power struggle history encoded into it.
Yeah, I think it's a political historicizing of mythology is a highly charged political manipulation more than anything else.
I guess I'm thinking when we were talking about what's the need for a historicizing of events. To me, I'm thinking in terms of convincing other people to win over to their faith. So now,
Right.
if, for example, you're talking about, you mentioned Hinduism as a possibility that is just based in a mythological world that doesn't ever make any claims to historical events per se. But it seems to me, well, it's possibly so enmeshed in a culture that you grew up thinking, for example, reincarnation. Everybody knows that that's what happens when you die, that all living things come back to life in another form, and the idea of karma and so forth, it becomes such a cultural thing. But now to win somebody over who's not part of your culture to that faith, like Christianity is inherently evangelistic, this command
Right.
to go and make disciples. And so, in other words, in my gut, I feel like, how could you ever appeal to anyone from another culture who didn't grow up with it?
Because see, that's why there's no such thing as evangelical Hinduism. It's because they don't have that tool in their tool belt. They're not commanded to go make disciples of all nations. It's just their own private mythology. The historicizing of the Christian origin story is the tool that makes people go out there and try to convince people. It's real. It's in history, and here I can show you that it is, even though they can't.
Exactly. But it does seem the only Westerners that ever become, look into Hinduism is just out of curiosity. I think that's the way it starts. Like you say, the Hindus are not preaching and going, they're not sending out missionaries per se. At least I don't think so. Although Buddhists apparently have sent out missionaries,
Yeah, what it was like when Buddhism came into India, and started moving. I wonder if wasn't there wars that resulted because Buddhism was a little bit more militant and trying to convert people?
No, I think it's the other way around. I think the war it's kind of like Islam. It's kind of like Islam in a way, where first Islam came and conquered, and then the religion started spreading. See what I'm saying? In other words, the religion was not what you're saying, that the religion was the aspect that made the wars happen, Reuven?
Of course I'm right.
Yeah, but that's what I'm saying about Islam. Islam didn't convince people and start wars. Well, I mean, the empire did. They came and they took over lands and stuff, and then the people that they conquered were swayed eventually by the ideas of these conquerors, but it wasn't the ideas which caused the conquering.
But there is an analogy, though, that there was, we have a historical Buddha who said these things and did these things. So there's kind of like an analog there to Christianity,
Yeah,
so it's not surprising that there were religious wars.
Even though, like Christianity, the whole story of the Gautama is for all intents and purposes, it's not demonstrably historic anyway.
What? Blasphemy.
Splitter.
So, any thoughts about the first 3 chapters, his argument? I don't know. Personally, I'm not 100% convinced that Simon Magus was Paul.
Thank you.
But I don't think, I think other people wrote various things. I think there's a good case that Marcion wrote, say, like Galatians and possibly others. So, I agree that the approach, the radical approach is correct. I don't agree with all the conclusions, though.
Yeah, I think similarly the issues I agree and disagree with Detering on are different from John's. I am highly persuaded by the equation between Paul and Simon. I'm also very persuaded, that the Book of Acts is pretty much fictional polemic that really is not very serviceable in figuring out the actual origins of the church. But the one part of his thesis that I was not persuaded by was his saying that the Pauline letters are like in what's the term? I forget the term. Like interacting with the Book of Acts. Like they're both responding to each other. They're kind of written contemporary to each other, and I'm just not seeing that. Everything I see, it still remains plausible that those letters are many decades earlier than Acts, and Acts refers to those letters without mentioning them as letters. It refers to the content of them. I don't think the letters knew Acts at all.
Early in the book, I'm with him pretty much full force with his alignment with the Dutch radicals in positing that it is very, very probable that none of the Pauline epistles are authentically Pauline in the way that we are accustomed to thinking. And I think that's the foundation of his argument. And I think I'm a little bit closer to Wayne than to John in thinking that it is more plausible. His arguments towards the equation of Paul and Simon Magus is more plausible than the positing of Marcion or a close student of Marcion being the author of the epistles.
Certainly not all of them.
Yeah.
I would agree with Wayne that the letters came first, and Acts is a response to that. Some, like you said, he uses them in some ways. Some ways it's outright polemic, an outright attempt to refute them. So that makes Acts quite late, especially if other people like Marcion had a hand in writing some of them.
Right.
Is my mic on?
Yes.
Would someone just briefly summarize maybe one or two of the arguments that the author was making that cast doubt on Paul's authorship?
Oh gosh.
That's
I would suggest that you listen to part 1 of the Hangouts of this book, because we spent like 2.5 hours on it.
Oh, okay.
I think we talked too much about our own ideas and too little about Detering's argument, though, in those Hangouts.
Maybe.
Thank you, Wayne.
Yeah, but you could read the book in a lot less time than listening to the Hangouts.
Yeah, that's probably true too.
All right, nobody wants to summarize. Okay.
Well, if I was able to summarize it, I might be better persuaded by it. Like you said, he wrote at one point that the epistles and Acts were like in interaction with each other. Or he might have used a different word, but something like that. That they were responding back and forth. And his argument for that, the example he gave, I forget what passage it was, didn't seem convincing to me at all. It made it clear to me that Acts knew the epistle, but it did not make it clear to me that the epistle knew Acts.
Yeah, but I think
his argument is based on things like that, and then also taking the fact that he thinks that the System Leben of the epistles fits better in Marcion's time, and that the theological content of them before the interpolations aligns with Marcion's theology, which I do not think they do.
But also, I think
it does place in the 2nd century, and I think that's correct.
But
Yeah.
also the reason for doubting Pauline authenticity, which is kind of a charged phrase anyway, it has, in many cases, has to do with the style of the writing, with some of the attitudes within the writing, like, for instance, in some of the greetings in some of the Pauline epistles. It seems that, for lack of a better term, it seems to be too self-adulating for it to go back to an actual person who's writing these things. But I mean, this is a really, really simple encapsulation.
But I mean, he's challenging the traditional 7 letters.
Yeah, that was
Yes.
one of the better arguments, was the fact that the writer of the epistles is too, boasting himself too much. It doesn't seem realistic. And also, he cites parts of where Paul talks about fighting with lions, and being stoned and stuff, things that just don't seem realistic and appear to just be fictionalizations about Paul. And he also points out that these have parallels in the Acts of Paul and the Acts of Paul and Thecla. So he's arguing that the epistles are basically taking those fictional writings as background for the character of Paul. That is an interesting article. It is interesting in my mind, but I don't think, on the whole, that it persuades me.
He uses as his springboard the work of the school known as the Dutch Radicals. First, the Tübingen school, which led to the Dutch Radicals. That's what he uses as his springboard for doubting the authenticity of the genuine 7, which is something that I've always had a problem with. Also, what are the arguments, for instance, for these 7 letters being authentic? The Dutch Radicals took that question on, and they came to the conclusion that there's no reason to think that there is such a thing.
Yeah, I went through stages. That first F.C. Bauer came up with the Halfbrief, and that was just 4 authentic. And then later on, the Dutch Radicals went at, I would say von Manen would be the best representative.
Yeah, and
doubted them all.
The important thing to say about this step in the evolution is the Dutch Radicals showed that using the exact same methods that the Tübingen school used to pare down the 7 to 4, F.C. Bauer basically could have kept going, but his religious sensibility stopped him from doing it, because using the same methodology, if you applied it to the rest of the 4, you would find that they suffer from the same problems that the others, that the Ephesians and Thessalonians and these other ones suffer from.
One thing we have to be concerned about, I think, with some of these radicals, though, is at least some of the earlier ones took Acts as being historical and rejected the epistles because they disagree with Acts.
Yeah, but
I think once you start with the view that Acts is fictional, that argument no longer functional.
That's the case. You're right. That was the case with the first questioning of a letter, which was of Romans by Evanson. But that's not the case with who I think the better Dutch Radicals are, like Van Manen.
Agreed.
And as far as the case for Paul being Simon Magus, just overview, he devoted basically a whole chapter or a very large section to it on the various points that led him to believe so. Now, just going through them all in summary, they're all intriguing. I mean, there's a lot of interesting correlations, a lot of fascinating coincidences, but I don't think they all add up.
Yeah,
that's me personally.
The ones that seem strongest to me is the fact that some of these older writings will give the words of Simon Magus, and then they're quoting what we know from Paul. And that was one that really fascinated me.
Yeah, it's just something I just don't know what to make of all that stuff, But I just, in my gut, I don't think you can make a complete identification. I just can't get the image of Jack Palance out of my mind.
He also cites the fact that this is not exclusively a modern view, that there were ancient people who also made the connection between Simon and Paul. So
especially the pseudo-Clementine, what's the word? The pseudo-Clementine...
Recognitions.
Thank you.
I feel convinced that... Oh, I'm sorry, Frank, were you going to say something?
I was just going to quickly mention that doesn't Dr. Price equate Magus with Paul pretty... I mean, he's pretty strong with that, isn't he?
Yeah, but don't tell him that we disagree with that.
Yes, he does, and I think he takes as a springboard the same evidence that Detering puts forward. Yes.
In fact, I think maybe Detering may have convinced him of it.
Yeah, I think so.
I think so. Yeah. It sounds that way to me.
You know, I at least was glad to read the book for the sake of his argument for the identity between the two, because it's always sounded weird to me whenever Price has talked about it, but at least now it seems more reasonable, and I do feel convinced that there's some sort of connection, even if they weren't the same person. At least people were making that connection, like you say in the pseudo-Clementine literature, for example. And so there are times, like we were talking about, what we read in Josephus about the when he tells us about the historic Simon Magus and the connection between Governor Felix and Drusilla and that wedding and all, and things that we see in Acts that Paul does with these same people, it seems to me that's like when it like really felt like maybe there's something here, because there seems to be an intentional separating Paul, the character of Paul in Acts, from Simon Magus, to have him engage with the same people but do exactly the opposite of what Simon Magus did.
Yeah, Acts just works too hard to show they're different people, and Acts betrays itself in how hard it tries to separate them.
Yeah, and so that makes me wonder, is it because they are the same person? Does Detering think that's the reason? Or is it because that idea that the two were one was in the air, and so the author of Acts is trying to make it clear, no, you know.
Yeah, that's what I would go with, the second one. Because, you know, it's hard to when all the traces are eliminated and all the tracks are covered, it's hard to say whether people were saying that he was Simon Magus to slander him, you know, and things like that. There could have been a lot of that going on. So to counter that, you could do something like Acts, which would be a totally legitimate response, as if he was the same person. Either way, it would work either way.
Can I jump onto another point really quick? Go back to something we were talking about earlier. Just on whether the epistles were written by Marcion or that time period. One problem I have with that is that it makes sense of the Marcionites having a love for the Pauline writings. It makes a good sense of that. But one problem I have is that the Marcionites are not the only Gnostic groups around at that time. There's like Valentinians and Basilidians and others, and they're also descendants of the Pauline canon. They cherished it also, and I think there needs to be a time period for them to divide, split from each other from their historical origins. I don't think they just appeared ex nihilo, right then, in the 2nd century. I think there had to be several decades where these groups splintered off from each other, and since they all value the Pauline writings, I think that came in early.
I think you're right. That sounds reasonable to me, Wayne.
Yeah, and I also think that whatever Gnosticism we can pull out of the Pauline epistles is not a fully developed, full-fledged Gnosticism as we would come to know it a century later. And so, yeah, there would need to be more development time, I think.
Well, I would be cautious in saying that, the Pauline epistles were in some way fundamental to these groups, because they could have existed when they got a hold of the writings, they embraced them, but that doesn't mean that they used them as the basis for their formulation or existence. They could have, easily changed in light of what they read there, for instance. So you just got to be cautious.
That's a valid point.
Well, one thing in the Pauline writings, there's no to me, I don't see any evidence of the Gnostic idea of the evil God creating the world and the real God being above him.
I agree with you, Frank, and this is something we've talked about
Yeah.
throughout this book. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree also. Yeah.
Which Detering points out.
Yeah.
He does say that, there's none of the popular Gnostic distinctives, that you will find there.
Yeah, there's no mention of eons and all that.
Right.
Yeah, I think there's too much of what we know about Marcionite theology that's just not represented there. That makes it unlikely Marcion wrote them. The one thing that could reverse my opinion on that is if it could be shown that our knowledge of Marcion's theology is incorrect. From Tertullian and stuff. Tertullian's written like in the 3rd century, so Tertullian could be incorrect about what Marcion believed, and could be talking about what later Marcionites believed, but not what Marcion himself believed.
I agree with you.
Just putting their beliefs into his mouth, even if that's not historically valid.
I agree with you, Wayne, and that's problematic just only because Tertullian is all we have, and so
Yeah.
if that's in that case, we'll just never know. If
Exactly.
if it's not representative of what Marcion believed, we'll never know that.
Yeah.
There's also an absence of the secret knowledge as opposed to faith by grace and that kind of thing.
Right, but yeah, you're right. This is part of what we're all saying about we don't really buy into that idea.
There's also debates about what is actually authentic to Paul. For instance, there could be some of that stuff veiled in different language that, in light of what's there, might be obscured because something was later added to mitigate what was said, so it doesn't look so Gnostic. But I think going to look at the Pauline literature for Gnosticism is a fool's errand because at the best there might be some proto-Gnostic ideas, but certainly not anything full-blown. It's what those later movements made of that material.
Frank, I just want to clarify.
True.
Frank, I want to clarify. Are you pointing out things that show that Marcion was not a full-blown Gnostic, or that Paul, in Paul's letters, that they don't represent a full-blown Gnosticism?
The latter.
He's talking about Paul.
Yeah, I'm talking about Paul.
Yeah, I would agree that they don't.
Right. And by the way, when we were talking about, because I at least was entertaining the idea that if Paul is Simon Magus, and Simon Magus, his theology possibly was closer to Marcion. Marcion was an accurate representation of Paul, Simon Magus, So in other words, that would just be a step along the way, a proto-Gnostic. Simon would be the founder of a proto-Gnosticism that eventually developed into full-blown Gnosticism, but he wasn't, he didn't have all the trappings that later came to be associated with Gnosticism. But I found it was helpful when we were comparing what the Pseudo-Clementine said about Simon Magus to Paul's writings. And you remember there were several points, I think, that some of us felt we couldn't reconcile. If the Pseudo-Clementines were representing Simon Magus as truly what he believed or taught, like, for example, his attitude toward the resurrection, you remember that? I just didn't feel that's the sort of thing that made me feel that even if Simon Magus were the Apostle Paul, I can't see how he would have written these letters.
Right. Yeah. That's a really good point, and it goes to show that, yeah, there seems to be an evolution of a character Paul going on from whatever the source of the letters may have been to the ideas of the author of the Pseudo-Clementine work. Because if Paul is Simon Magus, and the ideas of Simon Magus are not those that are represented in the epistles, there's a discontinuity there.
But I actually didn't see that much difference. I mean, I think the Samaritan thing, regarding Mount Gerizim was probably an assumption by the writer we were reading, not part of Simon's theology itself. And I think there's another thing he had in there that I thought was oddball thing, that I don't necessarily trust the source for what Simon's theology was. So.
Sure. Yeah, I wasn't swayed by that.
But most of the items actually did seem to match not too bad. I mean, there isn't that big of a gulf between Simon and Paul from what I could see there.
I would agree with you, except in the places where I did see a disconnect, they were kind of they were doozies of disconnects, like the resurrection, for instance.
What was the disconnect there? I missed that.
It was the whole idea that the pseudo-Clementines was talking about how Simon did not.
The pseudo-Clementines say that Simon did teach about resurrection, but that they discount it for polemical reasons. He doesn't live a holy enough life, so he must not truly believe it.
Right. I mean, that's
a slanderous thing they were saying.
It could be. Sure, it could be a slanderous thing, and the Samaritan thing could be a slanderous thing, but I don't know. Is it?
The Samaritan thing, I don't know. That the last line about the resurrection, almost certainly.
There's enough uncertainty there for me to just put a hold on that.
Yeah.
Actually, as I recall, maybe I should look it up, but I thought it said at the point that you're discussing, it says he teaches about. He teaches about the coming judgment, but he doesn't seem to really believe it by the way he's living.
Yeah, it was something like that. Yeah.
That's
a confirmation that he teaches it. Yeah.
I think that was separate. The belief in the coming judgment, I think, was separate from what he said about the resurrection. Like, in other words, one I thought was an obvious polemic, and the other I thought he accurately was saying, yeah, he doesn't believe in the resurrection. And we started thinking, like, I think we intentionally looked up in Bedouin, 1 Corinthians 15, in Paul's big discussion on the resurrection to see if it was, in Marcion's version, and sure enough, it was there.
I think even like Richard Carrier and stuff, he talks about Paul. Paul believes in the spiritual resurrection, not physical. So that could be part of the problem there.
Right. Yeah.
Whether one side thinks resurrection only means physical resurrection, and if you don't believe it's physical, you don't really believe in the resurrection.
Right. But if that's the case, that makes him not a Pharisee, which opens up a whole other can of worms.
But the whole Pharisee thing was just.
Yeah, I know, but it's
polemic.
I guess my point. But my point is, there's, like I said, there's enough uncertainty there to kind of just leave a question open, in my opinion.
The question we were talking about on this issue was whether Simon could plausibly be the author of the Pauline epistles, if what we know from the Pseudo-Clementines about Simon, represents his theology, and I think that is plausible that he wrote the Pauline epistles based on that. I don't think there's so much disconnect there that it's not possible.
Oh, I don't think it's not possible. I just
or not probable. I mean, I think it's actually more probable than not, based on the similarities.
I don't. I think there's enough dissimilarity for me to keep my question open.
Yeah. I think the dissimilarities are just aspects of the writer's polemic.
Could be.
By the way, on the issue you were just mentioning about the idea that Paul was a Pharisee, is that only in Acts? Because I thought that Galatians, Paul specifically claims that he was a Pharisee.
Right.
So in other words, if that section of Galatians is real, then Paul's making that claim. He never claims to have been taught by Gamaliel, which I think, anyway.
Yeah, but he does.
I suspect it is crazy talk anyway, that he couldn't possibly be that.
Yeah, I think that's a Catholicizing point. Yeah, I think that was put in to try to, let's say Judaize Paul.
Yeah. But I don't have a hard time thinking that Paul, even if he was not a Jew but a Jewish convert, became a Pharisee.
Well, yeah, but yeah, my problem with Paul's Judaism is not necessarily that. It's the fact that he doesn't seem to understand Judaism. He seems to substitute citation of the Old Testament for Judaism, which is, to me, in my opinion, not the same thing.
Well, I was thinking in terms of like the idea of whether he was Jew or not. You know, certain indications that he feels. He talks at least that the law is a burden. He says
Right.
that his view of the law is a way that a Gentile would view the law. You know, in other words, he wasn't born and raised with it. It wasn't the air that he breathed. It was a foreign culture that, oh my God, do I have to do this stuff?
Right.
And so I didn't think, and it's true, I see what, if I understood you correctly, I do get the idea that Paul, when he quotes the Old Testament, he does not quote, he doesn't feel compelled to stick to the quoting it in context, like he feels free to quote it any way he wants to
the service of his own points. Yes, I agree. I think in some cases he just completely misunderstands it. Whether it's intentional or not, I can't say, but I think he does misunderstand it sometimes.
But doesn't I always considered Romans to be an example of a really unique and profound understanding and eloquent explanation of the purpose of the law. I would be surprised that somebody would come up with that if they didn't have some foundation in it.
The one problem is Romans is one of the worst of the Pauline epistles with regard to Catholic interpolations.
Right.
Catholic interpolations?
Yes.
Yeah, part of what. Yeah, Frank hasn't been around for the Hangouts. We've been studying also Marcion, and the Marcion the reconstructions of the Gospel of the Lord that have been published in recent years, and which the bottom line with that is we tend to side with Joseph Tyson and John Knox, among a few other writers who are of the idea that the Marcion's Gospel is not an editing of Luke, but it's the other way around. That Marcion's Gospel came first and was added to by the emergent church.
And the same thing with his version of Paul's letters.
Right. Yeah. The Apostolicon and the Gospel.
Because the Catholics claimed that Marcion changed the text according to his theology, the evidence seemed to suggest that the Catholic Church later made their changes. Marcion didn't do it. That his copies of the Gospels, or of the Gospel of Luke and the Pauline letters, the 7 that he had. I mean 10. Sorry, he had 10.
He had 10. Yeah.
And that he didn't change anything. Any quotes that we have, because unfortunately we don't have the originals, but what we have of his are from quotes from the Church Fathers, and we reconstruct basically his Pauline letters, and it seems like these were the original, and they don't have certain sections of Romans, for example. Is it Romans 9 to 11 is severely, like that was a big chunk that was added, for example?
Exactly, yes.
Are you following this, Frank? Or?
Yeah, I've heard this. Yeah, I'm following you.
Okay. Most of the group here is convinced, or at least leans toward that theory.
Yeah.
Except I'm starting to have doubts about that.
I linked in the
Not
side
that-
chat an old article by Paul Louis Couchot that it's a little dated now, but I think he still gives arguments that have not been addressed. Nobody's countered what he's been arguing. It still seems to be the state of the art because nobody's dealt with the issue. But he does a comparison of Harnack's reconstruction of Marcion's Apostolicon with the Catholic version of the epistles, and he sees he's asking the question, which seems more reasonable? You know, is a longer version an expansion of the shorter, or is a shorter an abridgment of the longer? And in all the cases he looks at, it always appears to be that the longer is an expansion of the shorter. And there's even a place like in Romans chapter 1 where the person who wrote the longer version misunderstood a word. So so basically, you know, from Romans 1 up to verse 17 has the word katechonchon, which basically means to suppress. But the writer of Romans 18 through I think 2 verse 1 took that to mean to have or to possess, which is an alternate meaning of it, but they're being used differently by the two different writers there.
I should add, for the benefit of Frank, who wasn't here, that 2 books ago, the book we were discussing was Sebastian Moll's book on Marcion, called The Left Hand of God, I think, and in which he actually defends the traditional paradigm of Marcion as the editor of the Pauline epistles and the Gospels. And actually, we were fortunate enough to have the author here in one of the Hangouts with us, and there was a pretty productive discussion on the matter. But I think most of us, I think, tend to side with the opposite. After having read Couchot and Tyson and Knox and other people like that, it makes more sense, at least to me, that the traditional view of Marcion is a result of Tertullian and Irenaeus's polemic.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wonder that there's another theory that also is similar. I'm not saying I agree with it 100%, but it goes basically that there was an corpus of Pauline and Gospel, and that Marcion took it more or less as is with very little revision. The Catholic Church took the same material and highly revised it. So it's just saying that, say, like Luke did not derive directly from Marcion, but they both derive from a common source.
Right.
Yeah.
And the same for the Pauline corpus.
By the way, Wayne, you had once posted a video that I thought was very helpful that explained the point that you were just making. Do you have
I can find it. Give me a few minutes there.
Frank, I really found this short video very helpful on that point, trying to make the case that Marcion's version is closer.
Is that the one with the woman narrating?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that was a good one.
So most of the group disagreed with Moll?
Yes,
Yes.
Huh.
Which was fun for him.
Yeah, I was going to say, did you guys challenge him directly?
No, we were pretty. We didn't hit him too hard because but we did challenge him to some degree, but it was all in with respect. So
yeah.
Leon behaved himself. I thought he was going to go to town with him.
No, it's like I'm cool, I know what's up. So
I wonder if he was surprised.
I think he was, actually.
Yeah. He didn't realize he was surrounded by geniuses.
I don't know. I wouldn't say that, but he was definitely surrounded by people who are not content to just accept a paradigm, and we like to analyze things.
Yeah.
I also think it was that he was not facing a group of academics. That we took a little bit different tact on some of the stuff and the reasons why we thought things were different.
Yeah,
I put the video in put the video in the side chat. She's just dealing with the one passage in Romans, which is just one of the examples that Couchot uses. So the video.
It's a really good example.
Based on Couchot, yeah.
It's a very illustrative example.
Nice, thank you.
My only qualms with the video, which I think she talks too much to the beginning about her personal opinions about Paul, and the misogyny and stuff in it, that I think is kind of extraneous to her, to what she's saying. But
Yeah, I think once you get to the meat of the argument, though, she
Yeah.
has a very valid argument.
Yeah, she's just slow getting started with it.
Then you should have put the time code thing in there.
Yeah, maybe I should have.
So, in summary, like, I thought I enjoyed reading the book. I was glad that I did, because I wanted to hear the arguments, all the arguments for Simon and Paul being equated. I wanted to hear the arguments for the inauthenticity of all the Pauline epistles, and also a good section was dealing with Paul's, or the Pauline corpus, in relation to Acts, which I think was already, that I already considered Acts as fictional. So, but those are the three main pillars of the books, and I was glad that I got a chance to read those arguments for those two pillars that I had questions about.
Yeah, I'm glad I read it too.
It's worth
This was the second time I read it, and I'm glad I read it too, because I feel after having acquainted myself more with Marcion and the literature on Marcion, I feel like I'm better prepared to
Well, I like
assess.
reading the book, even if I read it before, with you guys, because I'm going to get perspectives and things that I never thought of, questions. And
Yeah, totally. I appreciate
so it's
this.
the
I
experience.
appreciate. One of the things I appreciate about this group is sometimes, somebody will make a point that I hadn't thought of, so I do like that part of it.
Even though my feeling right now is that the Pauline epistles were written in the 1st century sometime, maybe late in the 1st century. I'm not thinking of necessarily, mid 1st century. That's just my gut feeling. But I'm still leaving the subject open in my mind until I finish reading The Amazing Colossal Apostle by Reuven and Price. I don't feel I've heard the complete case yet until I've read both Detering and Price on the subject. So I think I need to withhold my judgment until then.
Yeah, I'm finding myself thinking about rereading that book as well, Wayne, because a lot of it was so dense. I think that's one of Price's most dense books. Most, because usually he has kind of a jocular style, but not in that one. And so I'm thinking about rereading it to make sure that I have some kind of an understanding as it relates to this book.
Well, as one of my side projects, I have the entire text of the Amazing Colossal Apostle in Logos Bible software. But it's redundant because I had already digitized all the Pauline epistles from the Pre-Nicene New Testament, and they're exactly the same text. So I thought, well, what can I do better? I thought, well, I can turn this into a commentary where I can eliminate the text from the epistles and just align his commentary with this other Bible, and I could scroll them together, and I could see, and create all these links and stuff. And my basic conclusion is that he doesn't add too much more than what Detering says. But on occasion, at least twice so far, he's come up with two unique things that I would say that he thought of. So you're not going to get a whole lot different, but you are going to get occasional Price insights.
Okay, yeah, because I read it when it first came out, but I didn't have the benefit of having this kind of a discussion group about it, so I kind of read it and it was dense, and then I put it aside, and now it would have come in, I think it would have come in useful for this reading.
Yeah, and I read it, but maybe I gave it too cursory of a read.
Yeah.
So doing what I'm doing now is forcing me to read it in detail, because there are parts that he didn't comment on. So I'm thinking, well, if I want this to be a real commentary, I got to find other places to grab stuff and stick it in here. So I'm really revising his book. Maybe you can do a second edition with all this other stuff I'm doing to it someday.
Yeah, the other thing on my agenda here is I know that Earl Doherty is very favorable to the Dutch radical opinions on many issues, and and he derives his his idea that the Christ myth theory ultimately from the Dutch radicals, and yet he rejects their thesis that Paul is 2nd century. And I'm really curious to read anything more by Doherty on the subject, or look back on the books I have of his and see where he addresses the issue.
But there's a big irony there, Wayne, because the Dutch radical school, if anything, the main...
Yeah, I know.
Yeah. The main thesis is the Pauline letters, and the historicity of Jesus was kind of a sideline at the end. Yeah, it wasn't. The historicity of Jesus wasn't really questioned by them until Bauer, really, and then Lohmann.
Yeah. No, I highly respect Doherty. I know he's very well read in their writings. So he's read all these arguments for the Pauline epistles being late and has rejected them. So I'm curious to reread why he's rejected that idea.
Yeah, like I said during that particular hangout, I would love to hear specific, well laid out arguments for the authenticity of the 7 or even the 4.
Has he written, Doherty, has he written in defense of the Pauline epistles or against the theory?
It may be in a marginal note or something in his book, or he might even have a chapter on it. I don't know.
He really doesn't argue for their authenticity. He just assumes it because, he just basically says that scholarship thinks this way, and I like it because because it fits my theory. I mean, he based his theory on the fact that the Paulines were the first Christian writings, and yet there's nothing historical to be found in them, and from there he draws the conclusion that Jesus didn't exist as a historical figure. So it suits his thesis,
And I don't doubt he's grappled with the subject, though. I think he's read the literature and grappled with the subject.
Yeah, it's spread out, though.
Okay, because I just thought, even if he in his books presupposes the authenticity of the Pauline letters, to me it doesn't necessarily mean that he accepts that. It just, he's going with the scholarly consensus. He feels confident that even with that, he can make his case strong. Because if he started discounting the Pauline epistles, he'd automatically turn people away, wouldn't even give him a listening to,
Yeah, but he's written in other forums and stuff. I know definitely that he rejects the hypothesis.
Okay.
That Paulines were late. I mean, he flat out rejects it.
If you want to look for where he's written on the authenticity of the epistles, it's actually in what he did on that one website. I don't know if it was Rydar, where he wrote a bunch of stuff against Bart Ehrman's book, and then he ended up creating a Kindle book out of it. He does go into it in that. That's probably the best place to look at.
It's actually one of the only problems I have with both Doherty's book and Richard Carrier's book. I think they're too willing to readily accept a consensus, and I'd be cool with it if they did. I'd be a lot cooler with the fact that they accept the consensus on the 7 letters, if they would actually post, write arguments toward that instead of saying, well, they seem to go, well, internal evidence seems to think that that's the case, and so I'm going with that. And I understand, actually, I agree with what Dale just said, that, they were able to make a strong case even with the authenticity of the 7, but I don't think they made a good demonstration of the authenticity of the 7.
So what do you think of Dettering's point in Chapter 4, where he's saying that basically whether the Pauline epistles are authentic or not, late or early, it really doesn't matter much for the historical issue?
I tend to agree with that, but I am interested enough in the authenticity of the Pauline letters to want to know why he thinks they're authentic.
Well, to me, it's like a historical question that I'd like to ponder. One way or the other.
Right.
I don't really think of it in terms of authentic versus inauthentic. I'm really more thinking of it in terms of, first century literature versus second century literature. It just seems more first century to me. But.
Well, first century, but I think I'm with you in thinking that they come more from the late first century, late like the 90s or something.
I can't really defend that. It's just a gut feeling I've developed. So
Wayne, you don't think that, well, some of it could be first century and some of it could be later?
Well, I believe the Catholic interpolations are later. I believe the pastoral epistles are later.
But at least 7 to 10 were in existence by the end of the first century?
That it's a gut feeling kind of thing. I think maybe not all 10. Now that's an interesting question. Maybe 7 are first century, and then the 3 are early second, and then the pastoral.
Or 4.
Well, they're definitely pre-Marcion. We've pretty much kind of established that. I think we could all say.
And pre-Basilides and pre-Valentinius, in my opinion.
Right, but I think, but they are also the reason why I don't think they date back to the 50s is the Sitz and Leben within them, and all the different self-adulations and all the things that are in it make it so that they have to be the product of a somewhat slightly emergent church kind of establishment having coming up, which means that they have to be post Jerusalem fall.
Yeah, that's my gut feeling. I can't give a good argument for it, though.
Is there any non-biblical source that identifies Paul's death?
There's one line in First Clement that's vague, and I would say does not identify it, but that's the one that people usually go to.
Does he say it's around the year 60 or no?
No, he just says that Paul and Peter were both in Rome and witnessed for the Lord, which is usually taken to mean the word used as martyroi.
There's also that other literature that says he went on from Rome to Spain, because that's in the Pauline epistles. I think he made that. He wanted to go to Spain. So they created literature where he actually made it.
Right, yeah.
What's the first time that we get the connection between Paul's death and Nero? Where does that come into history, church tradition?
It's an interpolation or an extrapolation from Clement, I think. I don't know about the Nero connection. I think that's just a church tradition.
Okay, I just was wondering at what point it became church tradition, from Clement or from who,
Clement and Ignatius.
Yeah. For me, the only reason I'd possibly consider the epistles being from the mid-1st century, being that early, and this is a pretty strong reason in my mind, but in the overall picture, I don't think it's persuasive. But I think that Simon, is Paul, and if Simon wrote those, Josephus places Simon in the mid-1st century.
Right, but there's too much contingent on that.
Yeah.
Yeah, too many contingencies in that, I think. But I see your point. We'd have to prove that Paul was...
I think it's Eusebius who says that Nero beheaded Paul.
Okay, thank you, yeah.
And milk squirted out.
Yeah, that's true. Sorry, but that's just funny to me.
Well, it looked like milk.
I thought Paul was attacked by lions and stoned. Aren't those how he died?
No, he was.
Sure, why not?
He was supposedly. Well, the traditional story is that he was decapitated.
Are you thinking of James, who was stoned?
No. It actually says in the Bible, in the epistles, that Paul was stoned and lived through it.
Oh, right.
No, right, yeah, no, but I mean,
I was joking with you guys.
By lions.
He these half-of didn't actually die from it.
Remember, it was a talking lion. He didn't attack him.
Oh, I remember one thing in reading an Amazing Colossal Apostle was that something about the pastoral epistles, Titus, Timothy's. It was like writing as if Paul did survive his experiences in Rome. I don't know if it was kind of indirectly hinted or something like that, but there's something in there that kind of implies that he didn't die at that point anyway.
Well, yeah, it even implies that he made it all the way to Spain, like you said.
Yeah.
There's conjecture that the author of the expansion to Luke and the Book of Acts was possibly going to write a 3rd book. And that just continues where Acts left off. That's just conjecture based on the ending of Acts.
Right.
But it's it seems like an interesting speculation that the 3rd book could even have been written and rejected. It could, Acts is so polemical and stuff, and things that aren't true, but just kind of made up. But a sequel to that could have been close enough to later people's history that no, we know this isn't true. You're pulling one over on us. So it could have been written and simply discarded. just speculation. I mean, I'm not saying it's likely. I just,
Well, it's an interesting speculation, but it would be problematic if the source of, let's say, Acts 2, we'll call it Acts 2, if the source was the church, then it would defeat the purpose of the church's teaching, kind of.
yeah.
You know?
The normal view is that there is an intention to add another part, but that for time reasons or something happened so Luke couldn't finish the third part.
Yeah,
That's a very popular view among many scholars.
It's usually the first line and only line of defense of dating Acts to 62. You know.
Yeah.
That and the we passages, which I think is just kind of silly.
Yeah. Those are more just evidence that Acts is hacking things from Homer.
I agree, or from other C novels or whatever.
Yeah.
Did you see Daniel's review of that book? Was it McDonald?
Yeah, Dennis McDonald. Yes.
He seemed to really appreciate the book. Thought it was a great.
Yeah.
Yeah, Daniel sent me a link to comment on a Rydar that Neil Godfrey had on Daniel's blog post.
Yeah, Godfrey took him to task on several things in that, but
he specifically said, "I'm not taking him to task."
Godfrey was polite enough, though, to not take him, out by name. He just did it, just some writer, here, because Godfrey wanted to address the whole community that was doing some of the stuff Daniel was doing, not just Daniel.
Yeah, he was using him as a representative.
Yeah,
but
I
told Daniel not to take it too bad.
Yeah, I think Daniel kind of resents it a little bit, but I think my advice to Daniel would be is you better get used to it, because if this is the field you're going into.
Yeah. I'd try writing to Neil Godfrey myself and asking him to be a little nicer on Daniel, but I know that Neil won't listen to me, so there's no point.
Can you re-explain what it is that Neil was saying about Daniel?
Anybody? Well, basically, Godfrey was criticizing the part of academia which doesn't that will say something is not right or a scholar is wrong or this point is not worth considering, but without any evidence, he just states it as a fact and moves on.
Yeah, this isn't persuasive enough. It doesn't actually say why it's not persuasive enough.
Right.
Right, which is one of the annoying things, in my opinion, about the whole historicity on that side of it.
And it got into the other point, though, that with the mimesis criticism, they're showing one writer, borrowing from another writer, that the differences are often part of what's going on. It's called a transvaluation. The latter writer is very often trying to improve the story in some way. Change the outcome to an outcome that makes a more moral point. Very often. So just because there's big differences in these stories, besides the similarities, the differences don't mean he's not borrowing. That's part of what transvaluation does. Is it borrows many elements, but turns other elements around in their head. Takes opposites of them.
Well, my advice to Daniel was to write more in-depth blog posts. I've read a lot of his stuff, and I think that he could do a lot more.
I agree.
Posts.
Yeah.
I keep my mouth shut about that, but I agree with what John just said.
If Daniel keeps reading at the rate he is and reviewing stuff, in a few years he's going to be another Price in his knowledge. Daniel is really reading like crazy, it seems.
Yeah, but there's more to it than reading. You have to digest it, assimilate it.
And I think Daniel's working on that and doing that. Yeah.
So
he's probably got other things to do too. So if he's reading to just review, you're not going to get the in-depth understanding of something.
But I think wait 10 years from now, and Daniel's going to be a pretty impressive force in the field.
Maybe. We'll see. I'm waiting.
Well, he better accept McDonald because that's rapidly becoming like mainstream.
Thank you. I think.
I mean, if you read the Axe report, I mean, McDonald is very influential in Soros Pervo. I mean, if he doesn't get on board with those guys, then he's going to be fringe.
Oh, John, do you know the status of a book that McDonald said he was working on, which is basically like a reference guide to every instance he can think of, or find in any literature that he knows of, to the New Testament borrowing from other literature? He's trying to make a book that's a complete index of that. All the references, all the references to Homer, all the references to Euripides, all the references to I forget what some of the others were, all the references to the Old Testament and Septuagint. He's trying to make a comprehensive scholarly list of all the ones he can find any claim to at all in the literature.
I would welcome such a book. I think that would be a really good book.
Yeah.
Well, he should give that kind of test to some non-creative people like me who are just workhorses that do crazy stuff like that.
Yeah, exactly.
He should be doing, groundbreaking work.
Yeah. I don't know what the status of that was. It was a few years ago that he said he was working on that. I know that kind of project can take many years to do, so it might be.
That's the kind of project that ends up getting put off on the back burner of the back burner.
But it seems like it'd be a very, very useful reference book. That's the kind of thing we need, because all this information, the claims that this New Testament passage is quoting this particular Old Testament passage or alluding to it, they're all scattered around the literature. They're not really consolidated in any one place.
And I think that's what you use, like you have a core of slave undergraduates at a university that you would put to work doing stuff like that.
He might be doing that. He might be farming some of the grunt work out.
As long as Raquel Welch has her whip up front, getting everybody
going. Regardless, it's a book that does not exist, and I think should.
Yeah.
It's a monograph that should exist.
I'm anxious to get a copy of it. I mean.
So I think we're starting to stray. So I think we should probably close up the Detering Hangout.
Yeah, because that's why I said what I did earlier about that I liked reading it, because I wanted to conclude my contributions.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm very happy to have read it, and it's going to change my thinking permanently. Even where I'm not sure I agree with them, I'm always going to be questioning these things.
Yeah, right on. I think that's a good result of some of these hangouts is whatever certainty that some of us may have about certain things, at least puts it on the table and says, look at this and look at this, what do you think? So
I just wanted to add something. Not having read the book, it was interesting to see your little power point there, John, because I pretty much have landed in the same place that Detering was saying there, because there's too much of the Bible that is just so questionable that I just don't take much of it very seriously, even though my Christian faith hasn't been shaken at all, and it just kind of reinforces my own view of it's more about personal growth and serving the communities. So it really does, like you said, help to distinguish the virulence of people drawing lines in the sand. So it's definitely right along my own thinking. People wonder, gee, how can you be a Christian when you don't read the Bible? Very easily. I live my life loving others and serving others, and that floats my boat.
I'd be very
glad you enjoyed that.
Very interested in your perspective, Frank, on some of the things we were talking about. The final chapter in this book, and basically Detering was trying to show how Christianity doesn't have to be linked to historical events, So it sounds like you would agree with that perspective, basically.
Well, I wouldn't necessarily go that far, because I think there's enough evidence of whether it was Paul or not. There was somebody significantly transformed by the life of Jesus, and I think that's kind of, to me, more evidence of a real person who lived, even though there's the stories around him have been embellished, just like stories around Paul have been embellished. But to me, the evidence seems to me to be there that somebody remarkable lived and influenced someone else who was remarkable himself, whether it was Paul or not. So that's kind of where I'm at. I don't need to know all the details because the basic ideas behind Christianity have transformed my life, but it has absolutely nothing to do with scouring and investigating the Bible the way you guys do. But I'm just totally in awe of the integrity of your scholarship here. So that's I definitely benefit from just observing your diligence.
Thank you. Of course, I could pull up Priceism right now and saying, of course Jesus existed. He spoke to me last night. Hallelujah.
Yeah, I think from a theological standpoint, Detering's version of a liberal Christianity, it works. It makes sense from the theological standpoint. You don't need the history to have the theology, but I do think you need the history in order to be justified in wanting to have the theology. I think there's no need for the theology if you don't have, reason to think that God has actually intervened in the world. And if you reject God having intervened, in past history, then I really think there's no good arguments left for theism, and that metaphysical naturalism should basically be the default position after that.
Right, and if it's about love and compassion, which I completely agree with, it's about honesty, it's about justice, it's about compassion, and I'm for all those things. But all those things to me have absolutely nothing to do with a person, whether it's Jesus or Joseph Smith or anyone else.
Yeah, Greek philosophers, before the time of Christ, would make some of these same claims.
Right.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. Some of the comments that are attributed to Jesus, where he's really presenting himself as an ascendant or central figure in history. Those resonate with me. I don't need to get into all the doctrine of churches or whatever, blah blah blah. And the other thing is, as far as historicity goes, I tend to think John Dominic Crossan is probably more right than anyone else when it comes to what happened to Jesus' body. Well, it probably got eaten by dogs like the rest of the criminals who were taken off the cross and didn't have a decent burial, and they just got devoured.
Yeah, I really like Crossan, by the way. Crossan was one of my primary influences. He's one of the first people that really got me into this whole field, and I was fortunate enough to meet him. And I feel what you're saying. I still, I've read since then. I've done my own study, and I disagree with Crossan on a bunch of different things. But yeah, I think that he's right. And I think you're right in the sense that if you choose a path, I think the word religion means to bind something. It's basically to commit to something, and I'm with that. But it seems to me that if the resurrection is only a metaphor, then I just take it as a metaphor,
Yeah. His new book.
I'm sorry, I was going to ask you, Frank, is it important to you that there was a historical Jesus, at least, though, or is that not an important foundation for your faith?
Oh no, that's I'm absolutely sold on that. In fact, that's part of why I like listening to things like what you guys do, is because I'm looking for evidence that's contrary to my conviction, and I haven't heard any yet. So, but the other thing I was going to mention is Crossan's got a new book out called How to Read the Bible and Still Be a Christian, and it's really good. I don't agree with him, which I'm sorry to say, because I have such high admiration for him. But to me, he's almost it's almost like he's taken the position of an apologist in a sense, because it's like he wants to value the Bible so much that he's looking for evidence that it is useful just by I don't know. You have to read it. His basic premise in the book is that you have these ideas that come from God, that people believe come from God, but then you have the historical evidence that the communities rejected what they believed God was saying and reinterpret it for their own purposes. And somehow he looks at that as being a organic evidence that the book is alive. Whereas to me, it just speaks of contradiction. So I'm somewhat disappointed in it, but it's still a good read because he always puts things in a cultural context. He does a lot of comparisons with Syrian culture that he thinks informed a lot of what the Assyrian culture informed a lot of what the Jews ended up in believing. So it's still a good read because Crossan is good, but I just get the sense that he's like trying to elevate the Bible more than I do. I don't see the evidence for it, but yeah, he's always a good read.
He's kind of a personal hero of mine, even though I disagree with him on many things. To your point of arguments for mythicism, I would recommend. I saw you held up a Doherty book, the first Doherty book. That was kind of the book that did it for me, but the one that really reinforced it was Carrier's 2-volume work.
Yeah, I've been very interested in all the stuff I've read from Carrier. He's very somebody of equal scholarship needs to challenge him, and I don't know if Bart Ehrman is up for the challenge.
No, I think Bart Ehrman is a decent enough scholar, but I think that he thinks he did it, and he's so wrong. I think that Ehrman's book was terrible.
Yeah.
It does feel like Bart Ehrman somewhat phoned it in. Like, I almost wonder, how much he had his grad students do the work, do the reading, for example, of these people. But if he would take on the challenge to go to head with Carrier on this, I think he'd be forced to take it more seriously, and I think then I would love to see him take it seriously.
Yeah, but I hate to put it this way. But I kind of think Ehrman has taken the coward's way out on this.
Yeah, I think he's taken advantage of the fact that he feels Carrier publicly humiliated him, and because of that disqualified him as being a reasonable opponent, and he's sort of decided to just
ignore him.
Yeah, stay in the dark.
What I want to know is what happened to the Price-Ehrman debate.
Yeah.
Dr. Price announced it based on information he got from a third party that it was going to happen, and it turned out that Ehrman didn't even hear about it.
Oh, that's too bad, because that would be really cool.
Yeah, I would love that.
But, basically Ehrman's was that, well, I don't debate for free. That's the bottom line, so you got to come up with the cash.
Yeah. Yeah, that's disturbing.
Thank you. Thank you for saying that, because that's one of the problems with this whole field as I see it.
I don't blame him though. Got to make a living.
No, I hear that, but in that case, I see him as a coward.
Didn't Dr. Price? Didn't he have or suggest a somewhat of a quick Kickstarter, at least a campaign of raising funds so that he could put this debate on?
Yeah, he did a video. He even did a video saying that they were going to start a GoFundMe or something. But that was all being handled by somebody else, and I just don't think that ever happened. That I know of.
Maybe Ehrman, in both cases, feels like he's met his match, and he's not going to engage in something unless he feels fairly confident that he's going to come out the winner.
I just think he knows that there's no way Dr. Price is going to raise the money.
I know.
Besides, I think he'd be better off raising money to pay his mortgage.
Yeah, we should. I think at this point, because I think we're straying far enough. We should bring the live chat to an end, and thank everyone for having hung out with us and put up with us.
Yep. See you in June.
For this particular book, and I think for the next book, I think are we going to do Friedman?
Yeah. Let's do Friedman. And two full weeks, right? What, June 1st or 2nd, something like that.
Right, and I think we'll post the details on the next meetup on the Facebook group page.
Cool.
If that's cool with you, Reuven.
I'm surprised you guys want to do Friedman's book, because to me, I've read that book, and it seems to be kind of rudimentary compared to the level of inquiry I've observed you guys in.
I agree, but I'm only one voice.
I still feel ignorant of some of the rudimentary stuff. I mean, I picked up knowledge on some issues from listening to Price and stuff, but there's big gaps in my knowledge I want to fill in.
I find that hard to believe, Wayne, but I've got to take your word for it.
Yeah.
I've been reading it these last couple of weeks and just finishing it up, and I've learned a lot. I mean, it was great to hear I think, a very strong case for the documentary hypothesis and for the dating of these individual. Like, what are all the things that lead scholars to date and hopefully, possibly even identify who may have written these different sources? So I found it very fascinating, and historical issues that I've never heard before.
Yeah, I enjoyed it thoroughly. I'm just kind of surprised because, like I said, I think you guys seem to usually engage at a higher level of inquiry than that book is going to provide. But that's just my opinion.
Well,
I'm with Frank on this, but I'm cool with going along with the group, though.
Yeah. Not all of us can be on the same level in all subjects, so it's good to go with what would benefit the group as a whole.
Plus, yeah, you know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of when I was finishing up my chemical engineering studies, and I sat down in front of a table full of experts. And one of the things they tried to do was kind of trick you by asking you really, really rudimentary questions about like really simple stuff, because it had been so long from your early days that sometimes we take for granted that we know things when we've forgotten them. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think it'll probably be good just for people visiting. I think they're more apt to follow the conversation and your responses to Friedman than some of these other esoteric studies.